So, any interesting stories that people just heard? None? There's got to be an interesting story somewhere out there. Nothing? He loves Bay Area traffic. All right. Yeah, someone back there too, I think. Oh, well, congratulations. Someone got married. All right. In the car or? Okay. All right, it was a slightly longer relationship than that probably. But okay. Well, yeah, so that's all that empathizing is, right? It's like talking to someone, asking them about what happened, like what actually, did they understand about it? What did they feel? And that's really all it is, right? Like, so it's just being open to understanding someone else's context. So anyways, it's a very brief example of this, but it's something to think about. So the next thing is define. And so define is where we're really going to dig into what does it mean about this problem, right? And it really comes down to just good old problem identification. So if you're familiar with this, I think Google about a year or so ago did a really great post on a bunch of kind of ways to do human-centered machine learning. And the first one is really, I just always want to echo every time I talk to someone, is that it's really not going to be up to the machine learning or artificial intelligence or whatever you're using as a tool to tell you what problems to solve. Right? It's just not up to that. So it's up to you. And so what that means is that generally you need to start to understand more, first at least, about what the outcomes are that are necessary for the people you're trying to solve problems. And so outcome definition is a really hard one and an interesting one to me. And in the case of like machine learning, this is what you would actually build your optimization function or loss function around, is what are you trying to get as an outcome? Now, the part I will say is that outcomes are not always simple as numbers. And so my time at Kayak, I worked a lot during the time where they were transitioning from a desktop first to a mobile first product. And so this was a very weird time, right? There were lots of people using Kayak on the desktop. There were more and more people using on the mobile phone, but when they would make that transformation from a desktop to a mobile user, they would actually search more, but they would book slightly less, or they're about the same amount, right? And that really got to this issue. We were trying to wonder, why is that happening? And what it ended up coming down to is that just because someone has a mobile phone doesn't mean that they actually are able to take more vacations. Right? They don't get more time off of work. They don't have more money necessarily. Maybe they do. But the truth is that the outcome of saying that the actual CPC or the idea of like ROI on these things staying the same per view was an outcome that didn't make a lot of sense. And so, when we talk about a lot of people, and again, I'm going to say you Silicon Valley people now because I don't live here anymore. But the idea of this like hockey stick growth really comes down to how are we maximizing or minimizing something all the time. And we're not really thinking about what the real numbers are, right? So everything is supposed to go up and to the right. And even in the case of, say, like Netflix, the CEO had this interview where he talked about, when it comes to binge watching, the only competitor now is sleep. And then he added, and we're winning, which, and I think he meant this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, right? But the truth is that how many hours can you binge watch and still keep a job and still have a real life in some way and have loved ones and things like that? I think Portlandia did an episode about that, but. So the truth is that, like, in this case, maximizing is not what you actually need to do. And when we talk about things like cell phone use, Apple and Google are both trying to understand better what the real outcomes should be for usage of apps. And so they're providing tools that will help you kind of reduce the amount of addiction that we're talking about when it comes to mobile phones. And it does seem like it's kind of mixed as far as the results. So I think we need to think more about the idea of I did a project that was basically a data science product for pharmaceutical pricing in Europe, right? And so this is where I got exposed to the concept of therapeutic index. And this idea is that, well, and maybe even taking a step back, like when we talk about what the law, like there's a law of 0, 1, or infinity in computer science, right? So there should either be none of something, as in there's no parents of the root directory. There's one parent of a particular file, or there's an infinite number of files below, right? And so we start to get to this case where we're trying to do 0, 1, or infinity, and if I can bend this analogy a little bit further, it's either we have 0 involvement from human beings, we have one system that does everything, or we have an infinite amount of actions taken by human beings. And the truth is that doesn't happen, right? And when we consider the therapeutic index, or the way that therapeutic index works, is that there's a certain sweet spot for the amount of medication before it becomes lethal. And so we need to consider that differently when we talk about our outcomes. Our outcomes are not as simple as just maximizing anymore or reducing to 0. And the reason why this is really important, especially for machine learning, AI, and those types of techniques, is that they're very, very good at finding a way to optimize something, right? When we look at all the things that reinforcement learning is starting to learn, is that computers are really good at cheating at games, is basically what we're learning. And so, from that perspective, the idea of optimizing is in some ways bad for human beings. And so my call to you when we talk about defining the problems we're trying to solve is they're much less about the idea of how are we maximizing things like shareholder value, but really trying to understand what is the right way for this person to include this product or service in their life that makes sense. So the first tool that we utilize a lot when trying to define things is once you understand a couple of the problems, you want to put them into a format that is called how might we. And I'll kind of turn this into HMW. Actually, it looks much better when you write it down. It's actually harder to say when you say it out loud. But how might we are essentially it's something that IDEO has used a lot, where it really suggests a solution as possible. And it's not about that there is a particular solution that we want to use, but it tries to give context around the problem that we're trying to actually solve here. And then, a really good how might we, it gives you a frame for innovative thinking. So it's more about a set of constraints than anything. And I think this gets down to, we talk about assumptions in the way that we do our work. We have a lot of assumptions about the way the world works. And a lot of them are wrong, actually. That's why things like dominant logic thinking, there's a bunch of biases, even blindness bias is another thing where you don't even know the biases that you're seeing. How might we's, or well-constructed how might we's, try to outline what are the assumptions that actually matter and are the constraints that we should consider in our solution, but don't over-constrain us into a particular solution. So that's a technique that we use a lot. And when we tried to do this at first for the field service operations group, we thought a lot about the how might we's of how might we make a field tech more effective, which is not as good of a how might we, right? So how might we make field techs better in touch with experts within their network, right? Or how might we, those types of things, right? And so we did that a lot for the field techs at first. We did find, though, that the leverage that we got was much better with dispatchers. So it was less about field techs by the end, and it was more about how might we only assign jobs to field techs when they're ready to go out, right? And there's a lot of things that you could do to do that. Some of those happen to be machine learning prediction or other types of things. So it's a really powerful tool to help frame problems. And I definitely recommend it when you're in this define phase that you do that. So I'm not going to spend too much time on problem identification just because I think that it's something that I think most people are good at. I'd hope that most product people are very good at. But when we start to move from a well-crafted how might we, I think, is really the root of a lot of these things when we start to get into ideation. And for ideation, this is how are we now exploring the space of possibilities that this problem set allows with regards to constraints. So, this is kind of like when we talk about reinforcement learning. It's the idea of a solution space based on some simulation or environment. But it ends up coming down to now how do we explore this space in a way that is effective so that we are not over focusing on particular areas in some ways. And so this is, when we talk about design thinking, there's a lot of discussion about this idea of diverge and converge. And there's even double diamonds, all this type of stuff but the idea of diverge and converge is really interesting. And ideate is where you're diverging as much as possible. So you're trying to figure out what are all the possible ideas that we could find. One thing to note is that I think this is where brainstorming is really horrible, actually. And brainstorming, the way that most people do it is they get into a room, there's, someone, whoever's the senior person says, okay, give me some ideas. And then everybody's like, I don't know, this idea is like, no, that's a bad idea, right? That's not how you do ideation. Ideation is really about the idea that you're trying to now get everybody's individual kind of experience, their viewpoint or kind of idea around what the actual problem is. And it's good to have actually a lot of diversity when it comes to that. So ideation is really about that kind of divergent aspect of things. And so one of the techniques that I use an awful lot for diverging or ideation is something called crazy eights. And so crazy eights are a great tool. Don't worry, I'm not going to force you to do one right now if you know what they are. But it's essentially, it's a piece of paper divided into 8 slots. And then you're given 8 minutes, 1 minute per slot to sketch an idea that would be related to the how might we that you just created. And so this is a technique that I've used with everybody. You know, it could be people that are designers, right, that are supposedly really great at drawing. But it could also be, it could be product people, it could be engineers, it can be executives, it can even be data scientists. But what it's about is it's about trying to get out as many ideas as possible, and you're doing this silently while you do it. So you're not necessarily like everybody's drawing on one piece of paper. Each individual is actually doing the sketching while they're doing this. And there's a lot of interesting techniques I've used to try to expand or even provide more divergence, and we'll use a technique that I utilize using randomization of card decks and things like that. We'll do that a little bit later. But this idea of like, how do you now provide the most divergent set of ideas? And we've done kickoffs where we've done 3 or 4 different crazy 8 sets just around different aspects of the problem to be able to get everybody's ideas out. So I think this is something that's very valuable to use. The next thing, and really the first kind of major exercise that you're going to do here, is what we'll call empathy mapping for the machine. Something that we created, at Philosophie, and it's originally from Cooper, right? It's just straight up stolen from design thinking because it is part of design thinking. It is a path towards something called personas, which is a way to kind of create archetypes or shorthands for the people you're building things for. And it's really, what it's meant to do when we talk about regular empathy mapping is that it's meant to collect as a team everybody's understanding or assumptions about the people that you're trying to solve problems for. So usually what you do, and this is the Cooper original empathy map, and it's broken into 3 different sections. There's lots of different versions of this. They break it into 3 as like, what does that person do? What are they thinking and what are they feeling? And so when you're actually, part of this step is usually for empathizing, right? So after I've gone and talked to people, I will start to build this type of empathy map around them. I may even do it with them, right? I may have them fill out their own empathy map because I won't always know what they're thinking or feeling. We've actually taken this and tried to flip it more into the mirror side. So the idea is that it's not so much about like, how does a machine actually feel love or something like that. That's not what we're trying to go after. But we're trying to understand what are our assumptions about the way a particular system will actually work. And what are our expectations of the way that system will interact with the world. And so we found this model as a way to do that. And a couple of these, I'm going to show you what it looks like in just a second, but these sections are also meant to understand better like what's interpretable from this actual machine learning or artificial intelligence system. How do people build trust with it? And just to be very clear, it's not about personifying the machine. It's not about doing that. So this is what we use. We've broken it into 5. There's a bunch of other empathy maps that use 5, but essentially it's what does the machine do? What does the machine sense? What does the machine say? What does the machine think? And what does the machine feel? Okay. So this is just, how does it interact with the world? What does it do to change the way the world is in some way? And so, it could be things that it generates. It could be things that it gives as far as recommendations. It could be just updating database tables somewhere. In our case, when we talk about the field service operations scenario, it would, in this case, we expected it to do a certain amount of automatic assignment of field techs to jobs. And so what did that mean, right? The next thing is senses, and this is really like, what does it need to know about the world? So it could be something as simple as, again, querying a database, but it could be video, it could be images, it could be other type of information. It's essentially context of the world. Like, how does it understand or update its understanding of the world based on these things? And one of the things that I think a lot of people get caught up on when they're doing this, especially engineers, is they start to think very specifically about how do they do things like image analysis. But the reality is that we're starting at the point with certain types of things like transfer learning and even off-the-shelf services that you don't necessarily need to build a full model to be able to do, say, image classification anymore. And so my only point about this is that if there is imagery and it's stored somewhere and it's either live or it's something else, I think it's just important to not get bogged down in that while you're doing this exercise. And one of the key aspects, just to bring up here, is that one of the hardest problems when we talk about team alignment between, say, designers, engineers, product people, executives, is that when engineers use jargon, and designers do too, right? So you're going to have to suffer through a little bit of design thinking jargon right now. But we do not speak AI in this room. We do not talk about CNNs. We do not talk about reinforcement learning. We don't talk about back propagation or any of this stuff. We don't talk about that. Okay, so those words are not allowed in this room right now. So in this case, one of the senses that we used for field service operations was really around what is on the tech's truck, because in this case, they were holding like $100,000 worth of parts as they were driving around. So understanding what was in their inventory versus what was in an inventory in the actual warehouse was really important to being able to build better models for them. Says, this is essentially how does the system become interpretable to people, right? But also how, maybe more importantly, how does it build trust over time through interactions with the people that are operating it? And so this is all about communication, right? Like it could be interfaces, it could be text messages, it could be something else, it could be a robot, right? But how is it actually in some way communicating with the humans that are involved in the situation? One of the things that we did for SES when we were building the field service operation system was it shows the reasons for assigning a tech. So a lot of the time, yes, just pure schedule information could be that this person is already booked somewhere else, so we're not going to use them, or this person is free this day, so we're going to use them. But it could also have something to do with distance. It could have something to do with certifications. It could have something to do with union requirements for those jobs. And so describing those reasons was really, really important for the dispatcher to be able to understand whether they should intervene or not. Thanks. This is like, what if this system is born into the world today, what does it need to understand from a regulation standpoint, right? So these could be heuristics. These could be experts in the way that they do their job today. I think regulations are a really key aspect of this, right? So what regulations do we need to adhere to? Say you're doing things like loan approval. How do you need to deal with redlining or avoiding redlining? In our case, we had to worry an awful lot about techs that aren't certified for certain type of jobs. And that was just a must-have. Like, they can't be assigned to those jobs, basically. And so this is where also some of the systems that we're going to be building, even though they're non-deterministic, in some ways they need to be deterministic. And so this is trying to understand where are those kind of edges. And then finally, feel. This is, again, bending this analogy to almost its breaking point. But what do we think is good or bad performance for this particular system? Right? And so this gets to what is the objective function, or what is the loss function? What are the outcomes that we desire that are really important for this system to utilize as signal on whether it's doing a good or a bad job? And so one example, and something that we ended up coming to after a lot of work with the field service operation group, was that the main leverage point we could have when it came to dispatcher services was avoiding return trips for the field techs. And that was because a lot of the way that these field techs would be assigned, or the way that the kind of systems, the contracts that were actually set up between the people that they were helping and this field service operations organization was usually flat fee in some way. And so the idea of having to spend twice as much time fixing something, and it could be for something that's fairly trivial. It could be for something as simple as I didn't have the part on my truck that I thought that I probably would have needed, or I didn't understand what the real problem was here. And so this was something that we focused an awful lot on and found to be, a very good leverage point. So this is what it looks like. You don't have to draw the robot face if you don't want to. It kind of helps the whole process, though. And this is the end. This is what you're going to see after you have this. And so maybe some terminology first. So before we jump really into kind of you guys actually just doing this and how to do it, you already know about Post-its and Sharpies. You already understand that it's kind of the sword and shield of the design thinker. Private ideation is something that maybe not a lot of people understand. So private ideation is this idea that while we're generating ideas, we're going to do it silently, and we're not going to talk to anybody else about it. So what you're going to see is there's going to be a cycle of private ideation and then discussion for each one of these sections. And so private ideation is about how are we now not interfering with each other's thought processes about this particular section and just getting all of the ideas out there that we have. And so that's private ideation, just to be very clear. So sometimes I'll hear like one or two tables like talking to each other. It should be silent in this room during private ideation. Deduplication. When you start to put these things up onto the board, you may find that there's concepts that are exactly the same. And so, you don't have to stress out about this. And I'm very pedantic about a lot of things, but you don't have to stress about this. So yes, you should place ideas that are same on top of each other because we're actually going to vote about it later. But I would just say it's something that we try to do while we're trying to minimize the number of ideas that are overlapping as well. If there's nuances between those two ideas, you don't have to dedupe, but that's something that we do. And then last thing is dot voting, okay? Dot voting is where essentially I'll give you a certain number of votes, and then you'll use, in this case, a Sharpie to draw just a tiny little filled in dot on the ideas that you think are most important for the entire board. And what this does is, again, we're diverging as much as possible. We're collecting as many ideas as possible within a time frame. And then we're having discussion as we're putting these things up. And then we're going to converge down to what we think are the most important as a team. And so that's where dot voting comes in. You can actually buy these like little dot stickers, and I'm sure those people are making tons and tons of money from design thinking organizations, but we'll just use Sharpies. I'll trust all of you will actually just do the number that you should. And then the last thing is that I'm going to use something called randomized prompts, okay? And randomized prompts, in this particular case, I'm going to be utilizing something that is, I'm working on a deck of trigger cards. Are people familiar with trigger cards at all? Anybody? Okay, not that many. All right, so it's basically, it's a deck of cards that looks like this, okay? This is the box. This is the 60 cards or so. And on each one of these cards are a different kind of question that you should consider. And so what's really important about this type of randomization is that, I guess the way I think about it, or in my mind, is I think about it as almost like you're taking whatever your set of biases and weights are in your head, and you're taking that and multiplying it times the problem you're trying to solve. And then you're taking some random concept and multiplying it times that. So it's this idea of like, or maybe another way that people could think about the analogy is that you're trying to like randomly assign things as you're moving forward, right? So the reason why I do this is that people do get caught up in their own constraints sometimes, and they're not able to consider things that are outside of that. So I won't be using, this is a card deck. This one is about like user-centric stuff. So if you ever are building kind of a UX or UI process, this is a good deck of cards to use. I've also used something called oblique strategies, which I don't know, is anybody familiar with oblique strategies? Yeah, it's Brian Eno, who's like a music producer and artist and designer and, quadruple or quintuple threat. He used these cards with the people that he would produce music with where they were blocked in some way. And so he had this card deck, which is a very nice case. It's very oddly expensive. But you'd pull out these cards and he would just give them that card and he'd say, consider this. And so some of them are very abstract, like courage, exclamation point. But then other ones are a little bit more like, take away the most important thing, right? Or, I liken it to these ideas of like, now draw a bad idea, right? Or draw an idea that you think is ridiculous, or draw an idea that would be best for the customer but worse for you. So we're going to be utilizing these prompts throughout these different workshops, but I think it's a technique that, and I really love this idea of randomization. And if you want to talk to me about it later, I actually ended up having a set of anyways, I'm not going to, there's a deep rabbit hole here that I'm about to go down. But anyways, I love randomization. I think it's one of those things that when we talk about the idea of blindness bias, this is the most easy way for us to understand what our real assumptions are, is to randomly probe at them, essentially. So I'll be using this as part of this deck. So what you're going to do is you're going to break into teams. Don't do it yet. I think like per table or per two small tables, I want 5 to 6 people at most per team. You're going to there's a bunch of paper up here in the front. You're going to take pieces of paper. There's tape on most of the tables, I think, or maybe just up here. And you're going to tape it up to the wall. You're going to find somewhere so you're not overcrowding. This is not the best setup. Usually we try to do like round tables. They can't do that for this size of people, this group of people, size of group of people. So put it on the walls, put it on the marble columns, which are blocking the view for probably at least 20 of you people back there. And then I'm going to announce each section. I'm going to give you a certain amount of time to ideate ideas. And it will be I'll probably give you like 2 to 3 minutes for the first one so you can get the hang of it. We're going to speed it up a little bit because we want to be able to get you to your break. And then we're going to take a couple minutes where you're going to place all the ideas in that one section. And by the way, we're going to only do one section at a time, okay? So you're going to do everything about, like, what does it actually sense, for example. And then at the end, we're going to dot vote the different things, and then I just want to recap with everybody about maybe some interesting ideas. And so we're going to do this around a particular how might we prompt. And again, this is what it looks like afterwards, and you'll all be able to like gaze at it like, wow, we just did something that was design thinking. So now, I want everybody to break up into teams at maximum of 6, but ideally 5-ish or so, but each table is totally fine, so go ahead and stand up. You've now all, I tricked you guys into actually doing a sketch. I said I wouldn't, but I did. So now what you're gonna do is, here's our prompt, okay? So as you may have seen, like we want to talk about AVs or autonomous vehicles. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to build an empathy map for the way for the machine in the way that we think that autonomous vehicles should actually operate in the world with us. And so in this case, you know, how might an AV interact safely with pedestrians and other vehicles on the road? And so that's the how might we that we're trying to go with, okay? And so what I want you to do is while we're going through each one of these sections, you're going to keep this how might we in mind, okay? So mostly around pedestrians and other vehicles in the road. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you first 1 minute, I'm going to give you 2 minutes because I said I was going to be very generous. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the does section of this, okay? And so I want you to just write a bunch of ideas. Again, it's private ideation, so it should be silent in here. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. I want you to write as many things that this AV would do to interact with pedestrians and other vehicles on the road. Yeah?
It seems like with a specific example, there's some overlap between does and says, which is part of the way that the automated vehicle thinks the
That's right.
vehicle needs to do our signaling. Can we
Yes.
keep signaling to the say section?
I think like let's not worry about that as much. I think it's okay to have overlap in these things. It's more about how are you inspecting a system from all angles. Okay, so there's going to be overlap, but there will be not be exactly the same things. So just you whatever you need to. Any other questions before we get started? All right, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to privately come up with as many ideas as you can for do. So we did does. Now we're going to do senses. Okay, and so I'm going to give you again 1 minute. I want you to come up with many ideas when it comes to an AV existing in the world around pedestrians and other vehicles. And so we'll give you 1 minute, and I'll give you a randomized prompt kind of in the middle. So go ahead and get started. Okay, and here's your random prompt. So what if it reacted to nonverbal communication? Try to integrate that into the senses section. So I'm going to give you 1 minute again for this, but it says, right? So how are you building trust with the humans? How are you helping them interpret what's going on? And go ahead, get started. 1 minute of private ideation. And here's your prompt. So what if it could talk with multiple people at the same time? So we're going to do thinks. So yeah, 1 more minute of ideation, but what's the regulations? What are heuristics? What are important things that this should do from the standpoint of like deterministic standpoint? Okay, go ahead and get started for 1 minute. And here's your randomized prompt, but what if it democratized a process? We're going to do feels. So again, this is not meant to be, you know, can it fall in love? But it's more about like what is good or bad performance for this particular autonomous vehicle? How does it know whether it's doing a good job or not? Okay? So I'm going to give you 1 minute to start ideating. All right, and here's your prompt. What if it took the gray areas into consideration? I think the aspect that's important about this is that you know, first of all, you've interrogated this system or this perceived system or this idealized system or a system that you're thinking about building from a lot of different kind of points of view. And so, and ideally, when you're doing this, you're doing it with people that are not of the same kind of group or type of person, right? So this idea of cross-discipline alignment or discussion helps open up understanding of how each discipline thinks about things too. Because of the dot voting, you now have a list of items that you can stack rank in how you start to consider them. The key thing, and 5 votes actually is probably not enough. I would probably for this number of post-its, I usually give you 10 or 15 in all honesty. But the truth is that you now have this stack rank list of things that are probably important for you to consider. And that could be, how do you start to investigate in the case of senses? How do you start to get that data? How do you start to actually consider systems to parse that data or to clean it? When it comes to the feel, how do you start to build objective functions around that? The thinks, how do you actually constrain your system in some way down to the deterministic needs that are there? So that's what's important. And one of the things that we're going to go into and talk a little bit about right after the break is something called confusion mapping, which gets into worst case scenario. But what I'd like to do right now is that maybe what are the most interesting things or most unexpected things people heard from their group when they were doing this exercise? Any volunteers? Oh, okay. Trolley problem. Yep. So the classic red herring moral dilemma of will it actually kill people actively or not? I'm just kidding.
I don't know that it's necessarily a red herring. If automated cars are driving every mile that humans are driving,
Yeah.
probably more, because if driving becomes easier, people will probably drive more.
Yeah.
The notion that that would never be encountered seems optimistic.
Well, that's fair. And I think this is a really good point, right? Is that when we talk about the idea of regulation in this case, right? The trolley problem is a lot about this idea of how do you make moral distinctions actively from a machine standpoint, when the truth is it's probably going to come down to what liability law is and what is actually goes to court and things like that. So anyways, I agree with you though. That's a very interesting and important aspect to consider.
And whether or not it gets offloaded from the manufacturer to the lawmakers, it's
Absolutely.
a decision that needs to be made.
That's totally right. Yeah.
Saying it's not our responsibility, someone else will take care of it, someone eventually needs to take care of it.
That's very fair. Yeah, and we'll talk about accountability later about these systems. So I think that's really important. What else?
I wondered about standing on the shoulders of giants. Like, we already know all this stuff, and so a lot of it precedes our work, versus if we were building the first autonomous car, would half of this show up on it?
Yeah, it's totally fair. I think one of the things that's interesting about this process as well is that after you then dot vote all these things and you have the stack ranking, there's always someone that's like, well, what about this thing? This just seems obvious, right? Well, it's not necessarily. And so I think that's an important aspect of this exercise, is that there will be people, I don't know if you guys are familiar with game theory or Blotto, Colonel Blotto as a game, game theory thing, but this idea of buying features, I think there's ways to game these systems. And so the truth is what this exercise is meant to do is to get all of your assumptions out. And then the moment that you then prioritize them, you have yet another time that you're trying to get out assumptions about what matters and what doesn't. Right? And so that's why we diverge and converge in those particular cases. And what else? Is there anything? There's no one came up with a bar on wheels. I feel like I always get that out of workshops for some reason. No? Okay. All right. No, that's fair. That's fair. I totally agree. Yeah. So are there any questions before we move on? Any questions about the process, about this technique? Maybe concerns that you'd want to share with everybody else? Yeah. Yeah, I think it depends on the time. So I think I've done it up to team sizes of 7 or 8, but then you need to provide, say, the problem is that in some cases, if you expand the time to something like 5 or 10 minutes for ideation, you get really, really crazy ideas because people start going down all these paths independently. The problem is that then you need to put all those ideas up on a wall somewhere and consider them. And so sometimes, I would just say that as you add more people, that time for putting up the ideas and deduplicating them goes up as well. So it's probably, 30 seconds or so per person. I don't know. That's kind of my rule of hand most of the time. I gave you guys very constricted time frames, but mostly just because you're doing this as an example rather than a real version of the exercise. I've usually done it in 45 to 60 minutes. Yeah, for a real exercise. Yeah, first question.
Where does value fit into the equation?
What do you mean by value?
So why you should do it in the first place? So at the end of the day, companies are out to make profit, governments have their own mission, or whoever. Lacking some of the why, you can end up with a great technology, but
Totally agree. Well, and that's where when we talk about design thinking, getting at the point of, so this is maybe where design thinking diverges a little bit from the classic way of building software, right? Is that because we're centering in on that particular human being, we're looking, whoever is that focus, we will try to make their lives better in some way. And so the way that we've helped with something like that is we've done, say proto-personas or empathy mapping, but we've done it for stakeholders within an organization, right? And so that's another way you can start to think about that. But you're absolutely right. And that's why like the idea of empathy and defining the problem, there's an exercise I didn't talk about here called challenge mapping, where challenge mapping is trying to kind of like why ladder up on why you do things, and then kind of how might we, or what's stopping us down below from a tactical standpoint. So that's another exercise I've used to help get at that type of thing. But I agree with you. I mean, that's the problem, is that are we all here just to maximize shareholder value? I think design thinking says no, that's not why we're here. But that is a case that we have to consider. Absolutely. But design thinking, I don't think, talks about that as much, in all honesty. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. You write it in your own personal idea journal. I mean, I have a lot of radical views about things. Like, I don't believe in iceboxes or backlogs, in all honesty. But the truth is like, these are all just ideas. Like, I think we need to be less concerned about keeping all of this idea cruft, because especially, I kind of consider myself someone who's very focused on agile methodologies. And so from that perspective, anything that I'm keeping as ideas from my past self is really constraining my future self, because my past self does not know as much as my current self does. And so I guess that's what I'd say is like some of the time when we're working with clients, they'll be like, well, we have to keep and document all these things. I'm like, just throw that in the trash. It doesn't matter at this point, right? Like, so that's what I'd say. I think it's totally fine for you to keep your own idea journals. I think this is great idea fodder for you to keep for the future, but I don't think it matters as much as we all think it does. Yeah. That's why we're doing the converge task too, is we're trying to understand from a multidiscipline or a cross-group point of view what really matters for all of us, rather than just one function. So yeah, we're 2 minutes over at this point. We'll have time for more questions at the very end as well, but you have a 30-minute break right now. And so if you guys could just be here by a minute before 11 so we can get started on time. We'll do another exercise around prototyping. Will be pretty fun, around role play. And so anyways, looking forward to continuing this tutorial with everybody. Thank you.